She arrived pregnant to marry a cowboy who hated liars. The wind on the prairie in late autumn carries a loneliness that gets into your bones, and that is exactly what Clara Bennett felt as the stagecoach rattled toward the small town of Miller's Creek. Her hands rested on her stomach, hidden beneath the folds of her worn traveling coat, and every bump in the road made her breath catch. She was 7 months carrying a child that the world had already decided to be ashamed of. The man who promised to marry her had vanished the moment he learned she was expecting, leaving her with nothing but a small trunk, a letter of introduction to a rancher she had never met, and a fear so heavy it sat on her chest like a stone. She had answered an advertisement for a bride, back when she still believed she had time to hide her secret, back when she thought maybe, just maybe, a stranger in a faraway town could give her and her baby a chance at a quiet life. But time had run out on the journey west, and now her secret rode with her, swelling a little more with each passing week, impossible to hide any longer. If you're watching this, and you know what it feels like to carry a burden alone, to be judged before anyone even knows your story, stay with me. Because what happens next will remind you that sometimes the people who seem the hardest to reach are the ones who end up loving you the deepest. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, because stories like this feel better when we share them together. Jacob Hale stood at the edge of his ranch with his hat pulled low, watching the stagecoach come up the road in a cloud of dust. He was not a man who smiled easily anymore. 3 years earlier, a woman named Sarah had promised him forever and given him nothing but lies, disappearing one night with another man, and leaving behind a heart so guarded that folks in town said Jacob Hale trusted his cattle more than he trusted people. He had agreed to write to a bride through the matchmaking service because his mother, before she passed, had begged him not to spend his life alone on that land. He had told himself he would give it one honest chance. One woman, plain and honest, who would build a quiet life with him, nothing more. When the stagecoach door opened and Clara stepped down, her coat could not quite hide the truth anymore. Jacob's jaw tightened before she even said a word. He saw it in the way she carried herself, the careful hand at her middle, the way she avoided his eyes. "You're further along than a letter should have left out," he said, his voice low and hard. Clara's cheeks burned with a shame she had carried for months. "I was afraid if I told you, you would never come for me." "You were right about that." His words cut through the cold air, sharper than the wind itself. "I don't marry liars, ma'am. I had enough of that to last me a lifetime." The porch behind him creaked as an older woman stepped out, a neighbor named Ruth, who had come to help welcome the bride, and she looked between the two of them with the practiced patience of someone who had seen plenty of hard beginnings turn soft with time. "Jacob Hale, the poor girl traveled 2 weeks to get here. Let her sit down before you decide," her whole character standing in the yard. Jacob said nothing, but he did step aside, and Clara walked past him with her chin lifted even as her knees trembled beneath her skirts. Inside the small ranch house, the fire crackled low, and for the first time in weeks, Clara let herself breathe. That night, Jacob sat alone in the barn long after the lanterns in the house had gone dark. He thought about the letter he had received months ago, the careful handwriting, the honest words about wanting a quiet life and a good home. Nothing in those pages had prepared him for the fear he saw in her eyes today, or the way something in his chest had tightened when he noticed how thin her wrists were, like she had not eaten a full meal in weeks. He told himself it did not matter. He told himself a lie was a lie, no matter how small or how big, and he had promised himself never again to build his life on top of one. But he did not send her away. In the morning, Clara found a basket of eggs and fresh bread waiting on the table, though Jacob said nothing about it and would not meet her eyes when she thanked him. Over the following days, a quiet routine took shape between them. She cooked what she could, mended what needed mending, and worked harder than her body probably should have allowed, as if trying to prove with her hands what her words could not. Jacob watched more than he spoke. He noticed how she rose before dawn, how she never once complained, how she flinched sometimes at sudden movements, like a woman who had learned to expect cruelty before kindness. One evening, when a coyote spooked the horses and sent Clara running out into the dark without thinking, Jacob caught her by the arm before she could stumble over a fence rail hidden in the shadows. His hand was rough and strong, but his hold on her was gentle, careful, like she was something precious he did not want to break. "You shouldn't be running in your condition," he said quietly. "I was trying to help," she whispered. "I know." His voice softened just slightly, the first crack in the wall he had built. "Just let me handle the horses next time." It was such a small thing, but Clara carried the warmth of it with her for days. Trust between them did not come with grand words. It came in small moments. It came the day Jacob noticed her wince while lifting a bucket of water and quietly took it from her hands, without a lecture, without a single word of blame, and simply carried it inside himself. It came the evening she found he had built a low step by the porch, so she would not have to strain climbing up in her condition. It came in the way he began leaving his coat over the back of her chair by the fire before he went out to check the cattle each night, as if making sure she would not feel the cold. Still, Jacob kept a careful distance in his heart. He would ask about her comfort, about whether she needed anything from town, but he never asked about the man who left her, and she never offered the story. There was a wound there neither of them wanted to touch, not yet. The town, however, was not so gentle. Word spread quickly through Miller's Creek about the pregnant bride who had come to marry Jacob Hales, and not everyone in town believed in second chances the way Ruth did. At the general store, women whispered behind gloved hands. At church, some families turned their children away from her as though shame could be caught like a fever. Jacob's own aunt, a sharp-tongued woman named Edith, who had never approved of the arrangement from the start, arrived one Sunday afternoon with words meant to cut deep. "You would bring a stranger's child into this family's name?" Edith said, standing in the yard with her hands on her hips. "People will talk, Jacob. They already are talking." "Let them talk," Jacob said, and something in his voice surprised even himself, a firmness that had not been there when Clara first arrived. "She's under my protection now." Clara, standing in the doorway, felt something crack open in her chest at those words. It was the first time anyone had claimed her, had stood between her and the world's judgment, since the day her own family had turned their backs on her for the very same shame. But the hardest test was still ahead. Winter came early and hard that year, the kind of cold that froze the creek solid and buried the fence lines in drifts taller than a man's waist. One night, weeks before the baby was due, a storm rolled in with a fury the old-timers said they had not seen in a decade. The wind screamed against the little ranch house, and somewhere in the middle of that howling darkness, Clara felt the first sharp pain rip through her body. She cried out, and Jacob was at her side before she even finished calling his name. "The baby!" she gasped, her face pale with fear. "It's too soon, Jacob, it's too soon." Jacob's heart pounded with a fear he had not let himself feel in years, not since the night his mother passed, with no one able to reach a doctor through a different storm long ago. But he did not let that fear show on his face. He knelt beside Clara and took her hand, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice at all. "I am not losing you tonight," he said. "Not you, and not this baby. Do you hear me?" He wrapped her in every blanket the house had, built the fire as high as it would safely go, and then he did something that would prove, more than any words ever could, exactly where his heart truly stood. He rode out into that killing storm alone, on a horse half blind with snow, to reach Dr. Reeves nearly 6 miles away, because Ruth's small cabin was closer, but she had no medicine for a birth gone wrong, and Jacob would not gamble with anything less than the very best chance for Clara's life. The ride nearly killed him. Twice his horse stumbled in drifts that swallowed its legs to the chest. Twice, Jacob climbed back into the saddle with numb hands and a face burning raw from the wind, because turning back was never something he considered, not even once. By the time he returned with the doctor bundled behind him on the horse, Clara's cries had turned to something Ruth, who had rushed over the moment the storm allowed, described later as pure exhaustion and pure fear all tangled together. But Jacob burst through that door like a man who had left every ounce of his own protection out on that frozen road, and had nothing left to give but what remained of his heart. He held Clara's hand through the long hours that followed. He did not leave her side, not once, not even when the doctor suggested he wait outside. He whispered to her through every wave of pain, told her she was strong, told her the storm outside had nothing on the strength he saw in her, told her that whatever came next, she would not face it alone anymore. And when the baby finally came, a small girl with a cry as fierce as the wind still howling outside, Jacob wept. He was not a man who cried, but he wept holding that tiny bundle wrapped in Clara's shawl, and something inside him that had been locked away since the night Sarah left finally, quietly, broke open. Later, once the storm had passed and the house had gone soft and quiet with candlelight, Clara found the courage to say the words she had been too afraid to say since the day she arrived. "I lied to you because I was terrified," she whispered, her voice raw. "Not because I wanted to hurt you. The man who was supposed to marry me left the moment he found out about the baby. My own father told me I had shamed the family and could not come home. I thought if you knew the truth before I arrived, you would leave me standing at that stagecoach with nowhere else to go. I was not trying to trick you, Jacob. I was trying to survive." Jacob sat quietly for a long moment, the baby sleeping in his arms, and when he finally spoke, his voice was gentler than she had ever heard it. "Sarah lied to me about who she was seeing behind my back for almost a year," he said. "She smiled at my face and broke my heart in secret. That is the kind of lie that ruins a man's trust in everything. But what you did—" He shook his head slowly. "You were just a frightened woman trying to protect the one thing that mattered most. That is not the same kind of lie at all. I was too proud and too wounded to see the difference when you first arrived. I'm sorry it took a storm like that to open my eyes. You do not have to stay because of the baby," Clara said softly, tears slipping down her face. "You do not owe either of us anything." Jacob looked down at the tiny sleeping girl in his arms, then up at Clara, and something steady and sure settled over his features. "I am not staying because I owe you anything," he said. "I'm staying because somewhere between that first cold morning and tonight, You both became mine to protect. I want to marry you properly, Clara. Not because a letter promised it, and not because of what people in town might say, because I love you. I think I have for weeks now, and I was too stubborn and too scarred to say it out loud. They were married in the small church at Miller's Creek that spring, once the roads had cleared and the frost had melted from the fields. Ruth stood as witness with tears in her eyes, and even Edith, softened by the sight of the tiny baby girl in Clara's arms, came to offer a quiet blessing instead of judgment. The little girl grew strong through that first golden summer on the ranch, and by the time she took her first wobbling steps across the porch floor, she had already claimed Jacob's whole heart without ever knowing there had ever been a version of him who was afraid to give it. He built her a small wooden horse for her second birthday, carved by his own hands through long winter evenings, and the first time she looked up at him with her arms raised and called him Papa, Jacob had to turn away for a moment so she would not see a rancher who never cried wipe his eyes on his sleeve. Clara often stood at the kitchen window in the evenings, watching Jacob walk the fence line with their daughter perched high on his shoulders, laughing at something only the two of them understood, and she would think back to that frightened pregnant woman who stepped off a stagecoach believing she had nothing left to offer the world but shame. She had arrived, carrying a secret she thought would cost her everything. Instead, it had led her to a home built on honesty, patience, and a love that had been tested by fire and storm and had come through stronger for it. The ranch that had once belonged to a lonely, guarded man became something entirely different in those years. A place filled with laughter, with small footsteps running across the porch, with the quiet, steady kind of love that does not announce itself with grand gestures, but simply shows up day after day, in a warm coat left on a chair, in a hand reaching out during a storm, in a father who chose a family that was never his, by blood, but became his by every choice that mattered. If this story touched something in your heart tonight, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what part of Clara and Jacob's story stayed with you the longest. Stories like this remind us that it is never too late for a broken heart to heal, and that sometimes the family we were always meant to have is waiting for us in the last place we ever expected to find it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because there are so many more hearts waiting to be healed, and so many more homes waiting to be found.